Welcome to the Site Closeout and Overview webinar. My name is Richard and I'll be your operator for today's call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, we will conduct a question and answer session. Please note that this conference is being recorded. I'll now turn the call over to Ms. Tracy Williams. Ms. Williams, you may begin.
Well, hello, CTN members. I'd like to welcome all of you to our 2013 program for the CTN Web Seminar Series. Today, as mentioned, we will discuss Site Closeout as an overview. And Maria Campanella, one of our CCC management members, will discuss this topic with you. And I'll invite Maria to say something about herself and how long she's been with the CTN and some of the things that she does pretty quickly. But we'll get right into it. There will be opportunities for you to ask questions or make comments. And if you would like to use the Q&A feature on your desktop, where's the live meeting console, please do so, and I'll moderate that for Maria. So at this time, Maria, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. And again, members of the CTN, thank you so much for calling in for this training today. As Tracy mentioned, my name is Maria Campanella. I am a project manager with the EMMES Corporation, and in particular with the NIDA CTN Clinical Coordinating Center. We are located in Rockville, Maryland. Throughout the time that I've been working at EMMES, I have been associated with the CTN, and I've worked in a variety of roles as a safety monitor. I have a background as a clinical research nurse. I've worked as a safety monitor, a protocol specialist, and a few years ago I became a certified CRA because I was interested in learning a little bit more about monitoring and regulatory responsibilities, both for the sponsor and for investigators. So that's a little bit about me, and we can go ahead and get started. And again, I encourage you all to ask questions as we go through this process. I know you've all been through some type of a closeout before, whether directly or indirectly if you've been involved in research trials, but I'm hoping this overview will give you a little bit more of an idea of how we think a process can be helpful in making it streamlined and easy, more efficient and productive for you all. So the objectives for today's training are to really help to explain aspects of closing out sites. I'm hoping that at the end you'll be able to sort of know what is involved in a closeout process and to define some of the preparation activities that occur even before sites become endorsed. And this is all in anticipation of closeout. We'll start off with aspects of closing out a research site. So you'll notice from this slide, there are quite a few pieces that go into a site closeout. The thing I think is most important about this is to take away that none of these things happen independently. They're all interrelated, interlinked, and they all happen continuously. There is no starting and end point. You've got monitoring visits that happen throughout. You've got changes in study personnel, training that goes along with that, supplies and equipment that you have to maintain, safety and regulatory issues that you need to address. There are always constantly data cleaning activities going on. And then, of course, there's the storage and maintenance of your study records. One of the components that was at the top of that previous slide was that of monitoring visits. The CCC conducts monitoring visits on behalf of the sponsor, and we're really there primarily as eyes and ears of the sponsor on the site. We want to make sure that we are reviewing all informed consent forms that are executed at the site, that we're looking at all eligibility criteria for all of the participants that you enroll, that we performed an accountability of the medication that you've been sent, that you've dispensed, and that you've returned to our pharmacies, and we're looking at primary outcome data reviews. These monitoring visits, specifically the ones related to closeout, could be conducted on-site by one of our monitors or remotely, and that depends largely upon the type of study that's being closed. Monitoring visits are intended to wrap up loose ends, namely to make sure that documents are collected, that, again, the disposition of study records, supplies, equipment are well thought out and that they are accessible. The visits are typically, as I said, very focused on the status of regulatory documents. We want to make sure that the safety and medical monitors have reviewed all of your safety information and that we've looked through any of the critical violations that have been reported, not just for your particular site, but we're comparing them with sites across the study to make sure that we have similar attributions assigned to each one of those violations. And then, of course, we're looking to resolve any outstanding data discrepancies. It's not typically a time of data review, however. A closeout visit is typically guided by the monitor's site visit preparation and site closeout checklist. So many of you who are in the process of closing out trials at this time have been filling out these closeout checklists, and you're probably very, very familiar with the aspects of the closeout checklist that we're most interested in following. These checklists are intended to help communicate the expectations of the sponsor to the site PI and the study staff, of course. Monitoring visits can also provide you with the opportunity to ask questions and can clarify these expectations prior to trial database lock. Same thing can be said about this closeout checklist. They really do provide an opportunity because it is a process. It's not a one-time event where you fill out the checklist and it's done and we come on a monitoring visit and it's done. It really does involve a process. And so during that process, we are available. Our monitors are available to help you with that process. Another aspect of that first slide was study personnel. We know that site staff is expected to dwindle as study activities become less demanding. You want to make sure before anyone leaves the site, though, that you've collected all of their appropriate documentation, and that would be CVs for staff, and this is not only for the sponsor, this is for your IRB requirements as well. CVs for staff, licenses, evidence of training, whether that's city training, NIDA training, NIH training, protocol-specific training. You've got all of those documents dotted, signed, any notes that need to be written to explain some discrepancies in that documentation. If the dates look confusing to you, they probably will look confusing to someone else. So that's the time you want to go through, and as each person is starting to leave the study staff, to really go back and review. Now, I'll come back to this later when we talk about what you can do from the very beginning. You definitely want to identify someone in the study personnel who's going to know the study and who has access to the data system. And that means EDC, that means the RTS system for uploading documents, and that they're familiar enough with the study that they can be available to ask questions when the CCC and DSC staff ask them questions through data logs. One important document, not just for closeout, but again for the duration of the study, is the staff signature and delegation of responsibilities log. This is a log that is a regulatory document. It's not a staff roster. It is intended to be just that, a signature and delegation of responsibilities log. So it's one that needs to be completed thoroughly. It needs to be paid special attention to. It is a baseline document that we use to assess a lot of the roles and responsibility and oversight at the site. So it's important that before your staff depart, that you've ensured that all of those boxes are checked off, that you've got the names and roles and responsibilities delegated, documented appropriately, and that you have completed a study participation end date on the log as appropriate. The CCC and DSC maintain access to study database systems based on that end date, the start date and end dates. And so what we've asked you to do in our network is to submit what's called the CTN Research Staff Information Form. That form is available either from the DSC or it's actually available on LiveLink as well. And that form, when you submit it with updates, including an end date, will help us to manage who has access to the trial database, and that's very important. We don't want someone to access the database after they're no longer on staff. Regarding supplies and equipment, throughout the trial, the CCC asks you to maintain an inventory, the record of how much supply you have in inventory. As the study starts to close down and participant visits and assessments start to dwindle, the CCC staff Usually a protocol specialist will work with you to try to lower the threshold of supplies that you have in inventory. It's important. It gives you less to count, less to keep track of, and less to have to give away at the very end of the trial. When you're looking at supplies and equipment for the study, one of the first things you need to figure out, and this is when you're going through your site checklist, it really helps, is who owns the supplies and equipment. Was it leased to you? Did the site buy it? Did the node purchase it? Then figure out who it gets returned to and how it gets returned. An example from some of our studies are ECG machines. ECGs are frequently used in the trials. The machines are leased by the clinical coordinating center from a vendor, and that vendor needs to get those machines back at the end. They send you packaging with specific instructions as to how to return the equipment, and so you need to think about those things in advance. I've got this piece of equipment. How long do I have it for? When do I need to return it? The supplies cost money. The equipment costs money. And the more that we can be conscious of that, the better off we are. I mentioned earlier about donating unused supplies. Before you do that, one of your responsibilities as site staff is to make sure that you are noting the lot number and expiration dates before you donate. That way you kind of have, you've made yourself aware that what you're donating is actually still valid for use. If it's not, then you dispose the way that you would dispose of other supplies at your site according to what the supply is. If they're needles, you would put them in a sharps container, things like that. If you are returning investigational products, study medications is usually what they're called, to the central pharmacy, then you need to follow the directions from the pharmacy and the CCC, and you definitely want to maintain all of those shipping records and keep them accessible in your regulatory binders until the study has locked. Safety is a component of regulatory documents as well. The medical monitor will, throughout the trial, ask you for additional information if there is information in your reporting that is not clear or that may require some additional information. One of the roles of our safety monitor is to look through those events for consistency in reporting. They're looking for trends, and they're looking for outcomes of reported events. One of the things you can do is to make sure that when you're reviewing these safety events that you've reported, that you are using no personal identifiers in any of the comment fields. You want to really watch your spelling. And this is something that, it sounds a little silly, but at the end of a trial, when the safety monitor pulls together reports with the statisticians and presents them to the Data Safety Monitoring Board, your comments are what becomes visible to that board. So we don't go through and clean the comments. We can't enter data into the fields that you've entered data, so that has to come from. So when we ask you about spelling, that's why. Protocol violations are a very similar category as the safety monitoring. We do review protocol deviation logs when we're on site, but we ask the site staff to go back again, QC those logs, make sure that there's nothing in the logs or in previously issued monitoring site visit reports that should have been reported in EDC and haven't been. Same thing about identifiers in common fields and spelling. It's because, again, these same violations are put into a table, presented to the Data Safety Monitoring Board, and potentially to your IRB. You want to make sure that no identifiers are in that information. That means not even my name, your name, my initials, or a participant's information should be in that database. You also want to review your PVs, and you should be doing this throughout the context of the trial as well, but ensure that you have a clear and succinct description. And you also want to have a corrective action plan. And it doesn't suffice to just say that you notified the lead investigator or that you notified the clinical coordinating center. We really want to see a corrective action plan that we can come out and see and verify that it's been done. Protocol violations are oftentimes discovered during data cleaning activities. We'll have back-to-back visit dates or 2 doses of medication on one day and not on another. Those types of activities that we notice when the data is being cleaned often come up, and the data manager will ask you then to report a protocol violation. Those are always discussions that can occur between the data manager, the protocol specialist, the lead team, an investigator, and the site staff. So sometimes clarity is needed, and so they're not automatically protocol violations, but sometimes they do become that way, and you need to report them in a timely manner. Regulatory documentation, again, is something that the Clinical Coordinating Center collects on behalf of the trial sponsor. You also have to have regulatory documents that you submit to your IRB. As many of you know, they can be completely different. What's reported to your IRB and what's reported to the sponsor are usually very different. The IRB typically wants more information than the Clinical Coordinating Center does. We do ask, of course, that throughout the trial you maintain the currency of these submissions, but sometimes at the very end of the trial, when we're going through each site in very specific detail, we may need to request additional information from you. Data cleaning activities definitely are part of a closeout process. The data managers and the statisticians are beginning to run tables and do what's called an integrity check, and they're generating queries. It's imperative that you are checking those reports and that you are looking at the queries in a timely manner and addressing them. And if you can't address them, that you're asking questions of the data manager. There are reports in EDC, and if you're not familiar with those reports, then you should contact the data manager and ask how to get to them and how to close the queries. For storage and records, the sponsor requires that you maintain records for a minimum of 3 years. Your IRB expectations may be different. Some IRBs may require 7 years or 2 years. At a minimum, you need to keep the documents according to the sponsor's expectations. If your IRB requires that you keep them for a longer period of time, then that's what you're required to do by your IRB. But the sponsor is expecting a 3-year storage and retention time period. We have physical records, paper records, and there are oftentimes these days electronic records. People are keeping master enrollment logs or phone contact locator information, those kinds of documents on their computer. These things should be transferred to a secure disk and deleted from your computers. So that should be part of your storage and record retention plan. All of that information does have to be available in the event that someone has a question, whether it be the lead investigator or the sponsor or another outside auditing agency like the FDA. So you need to have a plan. We need to know that plan. In other words, the CCC is responsible for collecting that information on behalf of the sponsor. If you'll note in your checklist, when you're preparing for site closeout, on the very bottom of the checklist, we're asking that question: where are you going to plan to store your records? How long will you be storing them? And who will be your primary contact? Typically, we've been asking for sites to note the node PI or the node office as the long-term regulatory contact for retrieval of those documents. Most of the site documents are returned to the nodes for storage and archiving, so it makes sense that they then become the contacts for that information. If site staff have any question about that, the nodes are very supportive and will provide you with all of that information. I'm going to pause for a moment, and Richard, if you can open up the phones to see if anyone has any questions.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you have a question, please press star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you wish to be removed from the queue, please press the pound sign or the hash key. If you are using a speakerphone, you may need to pick up the handset first before pressing the numbers. Once again, if you have a question, please press star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone. Standing by for audio questions. And I'm showing no questions at this time.
Maria, why don't we, I did want to go back, this is Tracy, I'm sorry. I did want to go back to the discussion or the point that you made about the investigational product. And I did have one question that maybe some others may benefit from. Generally, when it comes to closing out a site in terms of the investigational product, is there an accountability that needs to take place there?
Thanks, Tracy. That's a good question. It does depend on the type of study and whether or not the drug that is being used or the investigational product that is being used is affiliated with a schedule, like a Schedule 2 or a Schedule 3 medication. There are higher levels of accountability for scheduled medications because the Drug Enforcement Agency is very curious as to what gets shipped from the pharmacy, what gets dispensed at a site, and then what gets returned to the pharmacy. They kind of track all those balances to make sure that drug isn't out there floating somewhere where it shouldn't be. Other drugs that are post-market and that are not scheduled medications are oftentimes destroyed at the research site itself. In the event that that happens, we do want to see evidence of destruction logs. But that's not information that we would collect necessarily at the central pharmacy. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and again, I'm moving through these slides fairly quickly in the beginning, and I hope that that I'll be able to slow down a little bit here and answer some more questions for you all. But I think this slide here, actually, Tracy found this quote for me, and I think it's a great quote. When you have a great and difficult task, you work a little at a time, every day a little, suddenly the work will finish itself. And I think that's a great segue into the idea of the process itself of closeout. I mentioned earlier that it really has to start at the time that the site is endorsed, or even a little sooner than that. So if you look at this graph here, you'll see that the national training meeting is on the far left side. And that's really where the excitement for the trial begins. You get a lot of training, staff has been hired, everybody's excited to move forward and get the site endorsed. And we talk a lot about getting sites endorsed in a very quick time period between the national meeting and site endorsement. As you can imagine, lead investigators are incredibly excited about this time period because this is where this trial, it's the gun goes off and everybody's ready to go. And trials are measured by, their success is measured in a lot of ways. Of course, the outcome of the trial is important, but another aspect of clinical trials is efficiency and cost efficiency and productivity. And so one of the goals of that time period between national training and site endorsement is, of course, we want to get everything up and ready. But we've noticed over the years that this has a really big impact on closeout as well. That startup period, while it's super important to get it ready for site endorsement, it also, you have to think of everything that you do in that time period and how it's going to impact your site for closeout. Like I said, lead investigators are very focused, as is the sponsor, on making sure that that time period between the national training meeting and site endorsement is as quick and short as possible. But closeout's just as important. If you get to a closeout period and you haven't cleaned up your data discrepancies and you don't have your regulatory documents turned in and you haven't been able to seal up all these safety events that you don't know the outcomes for, that's going to delay data lock. That's another big focal point of these trials. Investigators and the sponsor alike want to see the trial conclude on time. The only way that's going to happen is if we can lock up the database, and the only way that's going to happen is if we have all these other T's crossed and I's dotted. Some early activities that you can keep in mind in that time period between the national training meeting and the site endorsement is to start knowing very specifically what the sponsor and IRB expectations are for regulatory documents. You want to definitely start at that point when you've hired your staff to implement a site staff signature and delegation of responsibilities log. Again, this is not a study roster. It really is a reflection of the people who are involved in the study and the time point at which they become involved. And it's not 3 months before site endorsement or 5 months before site endorsement because someone started to read the protocol and be involved in procuring supplies and everything else. It really starts at the time of site endorsement. That's when the study actually begins. You want to collect evidence of appropriate staff training and qualifications. That's an ICH GCP requirement, or not requirement, guidance, I guess is the best way to say it, is that you want to show that staff are appropriately trained and qualified. That can be done with CVs, licenses, HSP and GCP training or what's required by the sponsor, and protocol-specific training. Those things take time. HSP and GCP training are things that take time, and they take money because time is money, and for people to complete. The protocol-specific training, if people don't attend their national training meeting, you need to keep that in mind, how quickly you can keep those documents rolling and keep people trained and up to date. You want to know who your resources are, and you want to ask questions. So we can talk a little bit more about who those resources are later. After site endorsement and during the active or implementation phase, definitely the biggest word here is maintain. You need to maintain your documents every day. I mean, it takes a lot of maintenance to keep on track and on top of these documents. Things expire, notifications have to be submitted, SWAs need to be renewed, new staff come and go, and you need to maintain evidence of their training and qualifications. You need to control your supply inventories, not ordering too much or too little. These things are all part of the efficiency of the trial. You definitely early on want to develop QC processes right there on your site. The node does have a QA monitoring staff in many cases that will come out and help with site management, and they'll help to help you address processes and issues at the site that can be improved. But internally, site staff should be cross-checking one another. There should be a mechanism in place for, one person collecting the informed consent information, actually going through that process with the participant, and then someone else coming behind and checking behind them. So that's not the only place where QC is important. Of course, the safety documentation and closure of protocol violations, spelling checks. EDC actually even has a spell check option within the PV and safety pages that you can use to check that your comment fields are spelled correctly. You definitely, on a timely manner throughout the conduct of the trial, you want to respond to inquiries from the CCC and DSC. And again, know your resources and ask questions. At the end of that category there was a pre-closeout. It was during implementation and pre-closeout. We start to think at the CCC of pre-closeout once the site has gone through about 50% of the study has hit about 50% of enrollment. That's when we start looking at pre-closeout. We start to actually count down how many more weeks of supplies are going to be needed, how many more kits of medication are going to be needed. And so we really start to cut back and tighten up and lower thresholds, and we would expect you all to start anticipating the same. That, again, will help diminish the amount of responsibility that you have at the end of the trial. Final closeout activities are from the end of enrollment through database lock. It happens fast. It shouldn't be a surprise, but it always seems like it is. You want to designate somebody at your site who is your primary contact. You definitely want to include the PI in those discussions. The site staff are doing a lot of the work. The node staff are doing a lot of the work, but we need to keep the PI actively engaged at this time, even though we're not reviewing safety events anymore and activities. With study participants maybe in a follow-up phase in many of these trials, you need to keep people actively involved, and you need to decide right then who's going to be there until database lock. Anyone else that's not, we expect the staff to dwindle. Take them off your delegation logs, get them out of the database systems, and move on and just deal with the folks that are left. You definitely want to participate actively in the site closeout activities that are going on. There are data cleaning activities going on a daily basis, and again, there are regulatory cleanup checks going on by the CCC. You want to provide them with timely responses, and you want to submit all documents to your IRB and the sponsor as each request. Early phase activities to do with regulatory documents. Remember, it's more than just IRB approval. There are other things that are considered regulatory documentation. Again, keeping your assurance, your federal-wide assurance active with OHARP, maintaining evidence of training and qualifications, and thinking ahead. Don't wait. Know what your IRB expectations are for closeout in particular, and know the sponsor's expectations as well, because as I mentioned, they may differ. Develop your log, maintain it frequently, and ensure the qualifications. These are the same things that we went through earlier. And ensure that the CSCC and the DSC are aware of changes in your staffing by submitting those forms as soon as someone departs staff. In the early phase, you can develop site SOPs that help outline processes by which new staff are assimilated and trained to participate in the trial. The faster you can get those people trained and up to speed, you can submit their documentation and move ahead. If somebody's role throughout the trial changes, which oftentimes happens because one site staff member leaves and another takes their place and they've already been on the site staff, you want to make sure that that's updated appropriately on the staff delegation log. If you have any questions about good documentation practices, that's why our monitors and protocol specialists are available to help you. They can answer those questions for you to try to keep those logs as nice and neat and legible as possible so that fewer questions come up during the closeout process. As I mentioned, you want to develop a quality control process so that you can go through protocol violations, safety reporting, site visit reports to make sure that all of the requested action items have been completed, data queries have been closed. Use your resources. During implementation and pre-closeout, you want to focus again heavily on internal site QC measures. You want to provide the timely responses and you want to maintain your documentation. During implementation and pre-closeout, you can also, like I said, identify appropriate staff and identify where your physical and electronic study site documents are going to be archived and stored. As I said, that's typically with the node with which you're affiliated. You want to find out early on, how am I going to get these documents locked up? Who do I give them to? When do I give them? Who's going to be the contact? Those documents have to be available, as I mentioned, at the very least through database lock. They have to be immediately accessible because queries and other requests will come from the CCC and the DSC that are going to be taken directly from those documents. You need to keep them, no further than arm's length away so that you can get to them easily. Don't wrap things up and take them out of binders until data lock occurs. After that, however, they do need to be stored and archived as per the sponsor's expectations. Engage in the QC process. Complete the site readiness for closeout checklist that the CCC and the lead team have developed in order to assist you as sort of a guidance. And then participate in the readiness for site closeout calls with the CCC and DSC staff. This is something fairly new that we've implemented in the last few trials that we've conducted, where we have tried to, that we've helped with conduction. We've helped to outline the process, sort of the timeline, by asking sites to submit these checklists approximately 2 months in advance of the actual closeout visits that occur from our monitors. And the whole purpose of them is to really help keep these things, foremost in your mind, where you're going to store things, who do you return things to, when is your last patient last visit date, and then we start conducting calls approximately about the month before the visits actually occur. Again, that's an opportunity for an exchange with a protocol specialist, the monitor, the data manager. It's sort of a team meeting with the site staff to really talk about, okay, we're ready to close up. What do we need to do? A CCC monitor will eventually call you or contact you for a closeout visit. As I said, that could be an on-site visit or a remote visit, but in either case, they'll ask you for a visit confirmation. Very important to remember that you need to have that key site staff member who's going to be able to answer integrity queries, submit regulatory documents, bind things in binders. In most cases, this is not going to be your site PI. This is going to be a study coordinator or a research assistant who's been doing all of this type of organization and data entry and everything else, holding the study site together. However, the PI does need to be involved in that closeout visit. The closeout visit is actually a regulatory process that also has to involve sort of a PI acknowledging their role and responsibility for what has happened and what will happen at their site for the next 3 years and definitely through database lock. You want to respond to data queries in a timely manner and know your resources. Okay, I'm going to stop again and open the phone for questions.
Once again, as a reminder, to ask an audio question, press star then 1 on your touch-tone phone.
I'd like to remind everyone also we have a number of studies closing out, and if there are members who would like to share any of their experiences, we'd also be happy to entertain any of your comments because others are either going to go through closeout or even a soft closeout and can benefit from any comments or questions. So please feel free to chime in with your questions or comments. Or not.
I'm showing no audio questions at this time.
Okay, before I move on to the next section, I do realize that I keep stressing the same things over and over again about quality control checks, about knowing your IRB and sponsor expectations, about keeping staff involved, but also maintaining so that you are not caught at the end with a whole bunch of questions. I think probably most of this is all very common sense. But as I mentioned, what we've learned over the years as a coordinating center with the CTN trials is that there's a lot of activity that goes on in the very beginning and a lot of activity that goes on at the end. And trying to figure out a way that we can start at the beginning looking towards the end, with the end in mind, knowing that each of those is very critical in the timeline of the study, and acknowledging that this closeout process is important and that we're sort of all in the same boat together. So to that end, maximizing your resources, developing that closeout plan early on, identifying your critical site staff, and using the resources that you have available to you through email, through phone calls. We've got an RRTC staff that is typically a robust staff, very knowledgeable about the relationship that the node and site have with their IRB. They have QA staff that are quality control advisors that have typically participated in numerous studies across the CTN. They're very familiar with the assessments, very familiar with the way that the CRFs are completed. They can certainly help answer questions for you. They've worked with the coordinating center medical monitor long enough as well that they, on a variety of trials, know how to communicate and what they're looking for. And the RRTC is actually a training center. That's part of their role in the network is to help to train and educate and guide sites. So take advantage of that resource. It's a tremendous resource available in this network, and it's somewhat unique to this network. So definitely take advantage of that. Of course, you have the lead investigative team. That's your project and protocol managers at the lead node. They are a tremendous resource. This is their protocol. They're incredibly anxious to have it succeed and to close out and wrap up in record time. So ask them questions. Definitely reach out as a resource. You also have members of the CCC, the Clinical Coordinating Center, and the DSC, the Data and Statistics Center. If you'll notice in our email addresses, we are both members of or work for the EMMES Corporation. However, there are somewhat different pathways to get to each one of us, and we have a data manager and a help desk with the DSC. And the CCC, we have protocol specialists, we have monitors, and there's management staff and training coordinators at the CCC that can help you as well. If a question comes to one of us that we believe belongs to the other group, we communicate every day about your protocols and about your sites. So we are in constant communication with one another, but we encourage you to use these resources. There are a number of tools that you can use in preparing for closeout. Again, if you develop a list of key regulatory documents that you need both for the protocol and for your site staff, acknowledging that those lists may be different for your IRB and for the sponsor. If you make one giant list and you put an asterisk by the ones that belong to one group or the other, it might help you keep track of what needs to be submitted. You've got site closeout checklists. These are put together by a group of the lead investigative team, the clinical coordinating center, and the DSC staff. And they are completed by site staff, and as I mentioned, are completed starting about 2 months before the actual anticipated last patient, last visit, and that's the time for the gun to go off for data lock. So this is the time that you can use those checklists, help guide you through the process of closeout. As I mentioned, you also can have the data discrepancy and integrity query reports in EDC. These are accessed from your main menu page. On the left side, there's a link for reports. And on that side, you'll see integrity query reports and data discrepancy reports. And again, if you have any questions about those, how to access them or how to close the queries within, you definitely should be contacting your data manager. The DSC and CCC staff will be conducting readiness for site closeout calls. Typically, I'm hearing, and in the calls that I conducted with some of the studies last year, these calls can take as little as 10 minutes and as much as an hour. Depends on the shape your site is in. It gives an opportunity, though, for that one-on-one touch base. When you've got a big study with 10, 12 sites, it's really difficult on a national site call to go through and have everybody ask the questions that, maybe they're a little afraid to ask in front of such a large group. This one-to-one call with the data manager, the protocol specialist, and the monitor with the site staff really gives an opportunity to just ask all those questions that you maybe weren't sure were appropriate for a big call or that are very specific for your site. So we encourage you to participate in these calls and to make the most of them. Come prepared to ask questions and engage in a discussion with the CCC and DSC staff. The whole purpose of the calls is really to help you feel more at ease that you're on target. And there may be things that come up that are identified in your checklist or some data issue that comes up or some safety question that the safety monitor has. This is really the forum for those discussions, and they're intended to help make the actual closeout visits that much more efficient and productive. So just do a quick recap, and then we'll open up again for questions. But the best time to start preparing for site closeout is definitely in the beginning. Key components of site closeout are going to be your monitoring visits, looking at your regulatory documents, your study supplies, your equipment, know what resources are available to you. You've got your lead investigative team, your protocol specialists, data managers, monitors, a variety of resources available, and consider the key tools that I just went through that can be used for closing out the site. Okay, I'll open it up again for any comments or questions or any discussion anybody wants to bring up.
Once again, for any audio questions, press star then 1 on your touch-tone phone. Standing by for questions. Our first question online comes from Edgar Weiss. Please go ahead.
Hi, I just have a comment. We had a closeout session this morning at a site, and we did it by telephone. And throughout the entire 40 minutes or so that it occurred, to me, that one of the key components to being able to gracefully exit at the end of a study at a site is the local QA monitor. And I find that the more you're able to include the local QA monitor as a regular team member of the site, the better prepared you are for dealing with the monitors that come from EMMES and right through to what we would expect and be prepared for by the end of the closeout site visit.
Thanks, Ed. Actually, that comment's right on. I liked a couple of words you used there. A graceful exit is a great way to put it, because that's, of course, how every site wants to be remembered, is that they exited gracefully. And so I really like that choice of words. But I think I absolutely agree and can't stress enough that the RRTC staff is there to support the sites And they typically, as I mentioned, have quite a bit of experience. They are a regional research training center. That is their role within the CTN, is to help to make, every site a success within the trial. And so definitely include the QA staff, the regulatory staff, the note coordinator staff, any of those people that are available there as your resources, definitely include them in this process. It's very helpful. And we want to try, as a coordinating center and data and statistics center, to be as transparent as we can be. And it's really a cooperative effort. As I mentioned, we're all in the same boat, and we all want to make this trial a success, and we all want to see each trial succeed and each site succeed. So that's a great comment, Ed. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Has anyone else had some successful closeout or some really horrible closeout process? Tracy,
Maria, I did have one question. So
okay.
A number of folks on the call may not have ever been involved in a closeout call. What is that like?
Well, so you mean the actual readiness call or the closeout visit itself?
Let's start with a closeout readiness call.
Okay. Well, again, typically the way I've seen them conducted is a protocol specialist and a monitor will typically do sort of a preliminary review. They're looking at, this is before the call actually occurred. They're looking at the closeout checklist that the site staff have been submitting, and they're looking for clarity in the document, and they're looking for evidence of completion or comments about when something will or won't be done. So from the site staff perspective, you want to fill that out as completely as you possibly can every time that you turn it in to the coordinating center. Then the protocol specialist and the monitor are also looking through old site visit reports to make sure action items have been completed. They're looking through the regulatory tracking system, which is the document management system that EMMES uses to manage the trial files, the regulatory files. They'll look through that to see how complete it is, and based on the submissions that the site staff has made. And then there are usually discussions. We have team meetings every week with the data center, and we'll usually talk with data managers and see how is the site responding to queries, how quickly are things moving or not moving, what are some of the barriers that you guys are seeing. Talk to the safety monitor, and oftentimes involve her in the discussions during these calls as well, to see, are there some events that we can get some closure on that we need a little bit more information to resolve. And so those are all the activities that the CCC and DSC do sort of behind the scenes in preparation for that closeout call. What typically happens is the protocol specialist initiates the call. They are sort of the most focused on that protocol at that time. Our monitors, oftentimes they're going between different protocols, but the protocol specialist is very focused, as is the data manager, on that particular site during that closeout process. So they'll initiate the call, and they'll typically invite as many staff members as want to attend. Sometimes the calls are most efficient when the study coordinator and RA are on the call, because, again, they're the ones who are down there in the trenches doing the work. But it's also incredibly helpful, especially, again, given the node structure that exists within the CTN, to have someone from the node there who can help to answer questions about regulatory document submissions to the IRB, about timelines for archiving and storage, who's going to be the contact. Those are the kinds of things that they may have more information about. So including as many people as you can in that call is actually a good idea, up until a point where it becomes inefficient. As I said, the call sometimes lasts 10 minutes. Somebody says, hey, we're just checking in, everything looks good, you didn't get me that last document, yep, got it, okay, good. Talk to you in a couple of weeks. Some calls may be a little longer. Hey, we're having this problem. What's the barrier? Oh, you lost your password. So it all depends. Some sites have different levels of experience in closeouts, and so the staff are more comfortable with the expectations. For some sites, this database is new. They've used other databases in the past. And there's all different kinds of reasons, and it's really the goal of the readiness closeout calls is, or readiness for closeout calls, is to really help to pull all those pieces together. so that by the time you get to the closeout visit, and that's whether it's on-site or remote, doesn't matter, by the time you get to that visit, really everybody feels really good that everything's done. So these calls start sometimes 6 weeks in advance of the actual closeout visit.
Great. So in terms of the actual closeout call or the closeout visit, even if it's done remotely, it's like you said, summarizing all of the activities that have occurred prior to, that call or that visit.
Right, right. And if a remote visit occurs on site, which of course the CCC does conduct on-site closeout visits and has in the past, they're typically one-day visits. They last nowhere near a full day in most cases. Sometimes we are making the visit one in which we're looking at some data quality checks while we're on site. Typically, a closeout visit is not a time for data review. At that point, everything should have been done and cleaned up. And so if it's on site, it'll be a fairly short visit relative to the other visits that you've had. But same people will be expected to be there. You've got your key players who are going to help close the site out through data lock, and you're going to have someone there who knows about regulatory document submission, and you're going to have a PI present. So that's an on-site visit. If you have a remote visit, the only change in all of that is that instead of potentially having someone come to your site for 4 or 5 hours on a one day, and it would be a 1 hour, hour and a half phone call that you would have. Typically, I've seen them lasting anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. So an hour being the average time that a monitor. And the beauty of having these remote closeout visits that we're actually conducting at present with the studies that we're closing out now is that you can actually have more people involved, and they can be calling in from different locations. And so instead of sitting in one room with the monitor going through all of this information, you're actually involving a protocol specialist, a data manager. You've got a wide variety of people who might otherwise not be able to attend an on-site visit. So I actually think in many ways, from an efficiency standpoint and from a inclusion standpoint, these remote visits are actually something to be excited about. But I think the main thing is don't underestimate them. Don't think that they're casual just because they're happening remotely. They're no less casual. They should be treated with the same amount of respect as an on-site visit. This is a regulatory obligation that we have.
Right. So if there were any other questions, we'd like to open up the floor. We have a few more minutes left, so we want to give enough attention to the CTN members to ask questions.
Once again, that's star then 1 on your touch-tone phone.
Okay, well, great. Maria, I'd like to thank you. We can go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you for sharing this information with us. A number of us have never done a closeout, and then there are others who've done it but may have done it a while ago. So this information was very timely. And then there are sites that are, of course, going through closeout now. If there are any other questions, please feel free to send them through CTN training at EMMES.com, and we'll direct them to Maria, and she'll definitely get back with you, particularly if you have a site-specific question. That would be helpful. And there are a number of references here you can refer to. So Maria, thank you so much for coming, and we'd like to thank all of the CTN members as well. There's a survey that will be coming out to all participants, so please feel free to provide your comments. And we have another webinar next month on April 24th that will sort of continue this discussion, but from the perspective of the IRB and regulatory documentation, and it will be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So we'll send invites out to everyone. Thank you all for coming. That ends our webinar.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.